It is crazy how quickly the human mind can adapt to different things. You know, the iPad mini was my go-to iPad. I didn't use my iPad Pro at all for basically a solid 11 or 12 days. So once I wrapped up the review yesterday, I was like, well, let me take a peek at my iPad Pro again. And it's fascinating how, despite this product being 3 years old, it now feels brand freaking new. Let's begin. So of course these two iPads have a lot of design similarities, despite them being so far apart from each other in release time. Nearly 3 years in that regard, but I think what it's shown me is just how insanely far ahead the iPad Pro was when it was first introduced in October of 2018. The A12X chip was, in my opinion, the first time Apple Silicon was proving itself to be fast enough and capable enough that, hey, this could probably start to work on Macs. 2018 was around the time we started seeing leaks and rumors suggesting that Apple was planning a transition away from Intel. It had been referenced before 2018 for the record, but still, I think people actually seeing the Geekbench tests and seeing the export times on this iPad was enough to convince a lot of people, okay, yeah, you could start slapping this kind of stuff in Macs. And then of course, the slightly modified version, the A12Z chip, ended up being the first time we ever saw Apple Silicon in a Mac with the dev kit in 2020. But once I started switching back to a 12.9-inch iPad after getting so comfortable with an 8.3-inch variant, the bezels feel way smaller and way thinner on this thing, even though they're, yeah, basically the exact same width. I'm sure someone could get a electron microscope out and tell me these bezels are slightly thicker for some reason, but because of the ratio of the bezels being equal, but this display is so much larger, the content feels far more immersive on this display. And it also helps a lot that I'm a big sucker for 120 Hz, and now, for the first time since getting the iPhone 13 Pro Max, I have a ProMotion display across multiple devices. I'm using one on my phone that stays in my pocket, and then I transition over to a tablet experience, and I retain that buttery smooth refresh rate, which is oh so helpful, as well as Face ID, which I still say to this day, this is the best biometric implementation in any tech product ever. Some of you may disagree, and you're wrong, but that's fine. My point is that Face ID, as great as it is on my iPhone, still doesn't work in different orientations, whereas the iPad Pro, it works in portrait mode and works in landscape mode, and from a fairly decent distance, at least in my experience. Maybe some of you are using this iPad Pro further away than I am, but for the most part, I'm going back to the experience of just tapping the display and it unlocks. Done. I don't really think about how I tapped the display or how I rested my finger on Touch ID. I do still have to swipe up, which is a tad annoying compared to just jumping to the home screen on the iPad mini, but overall, the speaker quality here is fantastic. The display is still extremely immersive. It's not mini LED, but honestly, I still am impressed with the contrast ratio, the pixel density, the brightness overall, and I love the fact that it was the first time Apple finally ever in their history removed the Lightning connector in favor of USB-C. That has technically never happened before. They introduced USB-C on MacBooks in the past, but they had never taken away Lightning because they believed USB-C was better for this particular product. I feel that way about anything that currently has Lightning myself, but I'm proud for Apple, 3 years ago making that choice because it works with so many more accessories, so much more dongles, and it did take them a very, very long time, but now that I can actually edit ProRes video off of an iPad, editing with LumaFusion on a display this large is pretty fun and gives you quite a bit of control. I did edit one of my videos off of the iPad mini, and you can essentially do the same stuff. You're just working with a much more crammed interface, and of course, the preview monitor is much, much smaller. So basically, when I picked up the 12.9-inch iPad Pro again and started using it, it was like this breath of fresh air where it felt like the content wasn't too pushed in and competing over itself as much. Like between Twitter and Discord, I can fill the display with far much more information. And a little tip that I learned from my friend Nick Hansweeney on the Tech Podcast is that when you're using a phone that's massive like the 13 Pro Max, you go into settings and you turn down the text size. If you have good eyes and you can read small characters that well, it feels like the phone is displaying more information, because it is, and it just feels like a more efficient use of space when you take down the text size a bit, because you feel like there's just more content being displayed simultaneously simultaneously, so I ended up doing the same thing on my iPad Pro now to have a more consistent text experience between my iPhone and iPad. And now I feel like this display is much bigger than 13 inches because, you know, obviously I'm probably going to get used to this and then it's quickly going to become the normal and I'm not going to look at it and think, wow, this iPad is humongous, but that's the stage I'm in right now. And I'll also add that the screenshotting on the iPad is much easier when you have the volume in the old-fashioned placement. I did a lot of screenshotting with the iPad mini and you can't really do it with the one pinch method anymore. You kind of have to press the power button and up volume like this, which is just, maybe it takes some getting used to, but it feels more awkward to me. And of course, the speaker quality is much better on the 12.9-inch model. Even with the latest version of iPadOS 15 though, there's still no way for me to check what my battery health is because I've heavily used this iPad and I've left it plugged in at 100% for several days in the past, and I've used it for Sidecar a lot. I'm sure my battery health is not great on this, and I know there's some app I can download and check it if I connect it to my Mac, but still, I just feel like that's a feature that is present on iOS that is not present on iPadOS for some reason, and I think it personally should be. But overall, I definitely missed using this thing as much as I enjoyed trying out the iPad mini form factor, and I'm happy for people who like it. This has certainly sold me again on bigger display is better, and I think that's just the running trend I'm in right now as I'm getting the 45mm Apple Watch, basically one of the biggest displays ever on a wearable. I'm getting that next week. Now I've got the biggest iPhone display ever, and I'm planning on getting, you know, the biggest MacBook Pro that's available later this month, so I'm all on board the give me the biggest display you can right now, since I did a whole year with the 12 mini, and I enjoyed it and it's fun, but I'm ready for something else, and I think this is something I'm comfortable sticking with for quite some time. So for those curious, because I'm so impressed with the A12X chip, and I was even able to edit a whole video shot on my Blackmagic camera off of this device, A12X chip, still pretty insanely fast, and I personally think they probably could have put the A12X or A12Z in a MacBook Air, and it likely still would have been faster than the Intel MacBook Air they were selling. I have no real reason to upgrade this, you know? Like, mini LED is kind of cool, and I'm definitely a huge fan of Center Stage, but I'm just not willing to spend, you know, $1,100 to get access to those features, because I think there's more fundamental limiting factors with iPadOS besides ProRes support that would prevent me from switching my entire editing and channel management to this, just because I think Final Cut can still edit much, much faster. Plus, the M1X chip is coming soon, which is going to outperform my iMac Pro, whereas M1 chip is really, really good, but not quite that fast. So there's no plan, in my opinion, to upgrade this anytime soon. I don't plan on upgrading it next year. I don't even know if I'll upgrade my iPad Pro in 2023, because I'm genuinely having a very hard time figuring out what could they do to this thing to make me consider upgrading to it. Maybe if they did dual booting macOS, I could justify it, but even then, it probably won't have the insane fast silicon that the MacBook Pros are getting. So feel free to let me know how you guys feel about your iPad Pros. If you find one certified refurbished, I would highly recommend this over an iPad Air. Basically, I wouldn't recommend anyone buy an iPad Air right now, because in 2018, they made the iPad just too dang good. It's still unbeatable after all this time. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.